Over the past decade, a quiet transformation has been taking place in one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. While headlines focus on tariffs, sanctions, and trade wars, two of the world's largest nations are collaborating on an ambitious infrastructure project that could fundamentally alter the geography of international commerce. This is the story of the Arctic Express route, a 13,000-kilometer maritime corridor through the frozen waters of the far north that promises to rewrite the rules of global shipping. The stakes couldn't be higher. For centuries, world powers have understood a simple truth: whoever controls the sea lanes controls global trade. And for just as long, a handful of narrow waterways have served as choke points through which the lifeblood of the world economy must flow. But what happens when new routes emerge? What happens when the ice begins to melt and ancient barriers give way to new possibilities? To understand why China and Russia are investing billions into this Arctic venture, we need to understand the strategic chessboard of modern maritime trade, and why the United States is watching this development with growing concern. The choke points that define global commerce. Picture this. Right now, as you're watching this, thousands of massive container ships are navigating the world's oceans. These vessels, some longer than the Empire State Building is tall, carry everything from the smartphone in your pocket to the coffee beans in your morning cup. But despite the vastness of Earth's oceans, these ships don't have unlimited freedom of movement. Instead, they must squeeze through a handful of narrow passages that function as the bottlenecks of global commerce. The most famous of these is the Suez Canal in Egypt, where ships queue for days to pass through a waterway barely 300 meters wide at its narrowest point. When the container ship Ever Given ran aground there in March 2021, it blocked an estimated 12% of global trade for nearly a week. The economic impact? Roughly $400 million per hour in delayed cargo. But there's another choke point that matters even more to Asian economies: the Strait of Malacca. Stretching between Indonesia and Malaysia, this 800-kilometer-long passage is only 2.8 kilometers wide at its narrowest section. Yet through this slender waterway flows nearly a third of all global maritime trade. More than 80,000 vessels transit the strait annually. For China, the world's largest trading nation, approximately 80% of its crude oil imports pass through this single corridor. This creates what Chinese strategists have long called the Malacca Dilemma, an uncomfortable dependence on a waterway that could theoretically be blocked, monitored, or controlled by external powers. It's not paranoia, it's geography. And in the game of geopolitics, geography is destiny. The United States has long understood this vulnerability. American military planners have maintained a significant presence throughout Southeast Asia, with key installations including Singapore's Changi Naval Base, one of the most strategic military facilities in the region. Recent years have seen increased discussion about expanding this presence to locations like Australia's Cocos Islands and potentially Bangladesh's St. Martin Island. The message is clear. In any future conflict, the ability to restrict access to these maritime highways would provide enormous leverage. For China, this represents an unacceptable strategic weakness. No matter how powerful your economy becomes, if a potential adversary can cut your supply lines with relative ease, your strength is built on a fragile foundation. This is where the Arctic enters the picture. The frozen frontier. A brief history of northern ambitions. The idea of an Arctic shipping route is hardly new. In fact, the dream of finding a navigable passage through the frozen north has haunted explorers for more than 4 centuries. Back in the 1500s, when Portuguese and Spanish empires controlled the southern maritime routes around Africa and South America, merchants and explorers from England, Holland, and other northern European nations began looking for alternatives. They believed that somewhere in the icy waters above Russia and Canada, there might exist a passage that could provide direct access to the lucrative markets of Asia. What followed were decades of failed expeditions, ships crushed in ice, and lives lost to the brutal Arctic environment. These weren't small setbacks. Entire crews would vanish into the white emptiness, their fates unknown for decades or even centuries. The Arctic, it seemed, would guard its secrets jealously. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that explorers finally confirmed the existence of what came to be known as the Northeast Passage along Russia's northern coast, and the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. But confirming these routes existed was one thing. Making them practically navigable was quite another. The Soviet Union, with its vast Arctic coastline and determination to exploit the region's natural resources, became the first nation to seriously develop Arctic shipping infrastructure. By the mid-20th century, Soviet icebreakers were clearing paths for cargo vessels transporting oil, gas, and minerals from Siberia's remote fields. At its peak, cargo volume along the Soviet Arctic route reached 6.6 million tons annually, an impressive figure, but still a tiny fraction of global shipping traffic. Then came the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and with it, the decline of Arctic route development. Economic chaos and political instability meant that Russia's attention turned elsewhere. The Arctic routes, expensive to maintain and requiring constant icebreaker support, fell into relative neglect. For nearly 2 decades, the northeastern waters remained a marginal shipping corridor, used primarily for domestic Russian transport. But two forces were quietly working to change this equation: climate change and China's economic rise. The game changers, melting ice and rising ambitions. Climate change, for all its devastating consequences, has had one undeniable effect in the Arctic. The ice is melting. Summer sea ice extent in the Arctic has declined by approximately 13% per decade since 1979. What was once year-round ice coverage now melts substantially during the warmer months. By some projections, the Arctic Ocean could see ice-free summers as early as the 2030s or 2040s. For shipping companies, this represents an unprecedented opportunity. Routes that were impassable for most of the year are now navigable for extended periods. The window of opportunity is opening wider with each passing year. Simultaneously, China was experiencing the most dramatic economic expansion in modern history. Between 2000 and 2020, China's GDP grew from approximately $1.2 trillion to over $14 trillion. The country transformed from a regional manufacturer into the world's factory, and its appetite for resources and need for export routes grew proportionally. This is where interests converged. Russia, seeking to modernize its economy and develop its vast Arctic resources, needed investment and customers. China, seeking to diversify its trade routes and reduce vulnerability to chokepoint disruptions, needed alternatives. The Arctic route represented a solution to both nations' strategic challenges. In 2017, the partnership began to take formal shape. At the Belt and Road International Cooperation Summit Forum that year, Russian President Vladimir Putin explicitly proposed integrating the Arctic route into China's massive Belt and Road initiative, creating what he termed an Ice Silk Road. The name deliberately echoed the ancient Silk Road that once connected East and West, suggesting ambitions for a new age of Eurasian commerce. Just months later, during a state visit to Russia, Chinese leaders formally endorsed this vision, committing to strengthen cooperation on Arctic route development. It wasn't just diplomatic rhetoric, it was the beginning of a serious infrastructure partnership. So, what exactly does this Arctic Express route look like? How does it work, and what makes it potentially revolutionary? Well, the system is actually composed of 3 distinct segments, functioning sort of like a relay race across some of the planet's most extreme environments. The first leg begins inland, at the Belomorsk Logistics Center in Russia's northwestern region. Here, cargo arrives by rail from Moscow and other Russian cities, traveling approximately 1,200 kilometers to reach the port of Arkhangelsk on the White Sea. Now, this isn't just any port. Arkhangelsk has been Russia's window to the north for centuries. Founded in 1584 and serving as the country's primary maritime gateway before the establishment of St. Petersburg. From Arkhangelsk, the second and most challenging segment begins. Ships enter the Northeast Passage, also known as the Northern Sea Route, hugging Russia's Arctic coastline for about 5,600 kilometers. This is really where the journey becomes truly remarkable. The route passes through the Barents Sea, navigates past the Kara Gate, threads through the narrow Vilkitsky Strait between the Taimyr Peninsula and Severnaya Zemlya, continues through the Laptov Sea and East Siberian Sea, and finally reaches the Bering Strait, that narrow passage between Russia and Alaska where the Arctic Ocean meets the Pacific. This segment runs almost entirely through Russian territorial waters, which provides both advantages and challenges. The advantage is that Russia has sovereignty over the route and can develop it without complex international negotiations. The challenge, though, is that the infrastructure requirements are enormous and the environmental conditions are among the harshest on Earth. The final segment covers approximately 6,600 kilometers from the Bering Strait down the western edge of the Pacific Ocean to Chinese ports like Shanghai, Ningbo, or Shenzhen. This is the most straightforward portion, using well-established maritime lanes through relatively ice-free waters. Put it all together, and you have a route of about 13,200 kilometers that can be traversed in 20 to 25 days under optimal conditions. Compare this to the traditional route from Shanghai to European ports via the Strait of Malacca, Indian Ocean, Red Sea, and Suez Canal, a journey of about 21,000 kilometers requiring 35 to 40 days of sailing time. The numbers are pretty compelling. The Arctic route is roughly 40% shorter and could save nearly 2 weeks in transit time. For shipping companies, this translates directly into reduced fuel costs, lower crew expenses, and the ability to make more round trips annually with the same vessels. For exporters and importers, it means fresher products, reduced inventory in transit, and improved supply chain efficiency. But, the advantages go beyond mere distance and time. The Arctic Express route offers several strategic advantages that make it attractive beyond simple economics. First, let's consider the security dimension. The traditional routes through the Strait of Malacca and Suez Canal pass through some of the world's most politically unstable regions. The waters off Somalia became notorious for piracy in the 2000s, forcing shipping companies to hire armed security teams and significantly increasing insurance costs. The Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, and approaches to the Suez Canal traverse regions affected by conflicts in Yemen, Libya, and elsewhere. Even in peacetime, these routes require constant vigilance. The Arctic route, by contrast, passes through waters where piracy is essentially non-existent. The environmental conditions that make Arctic navigation challenging also make it impossible for the small, fast boats typically used by pirates. There are no hostile nations along the route. It runs through Russian territorial waters or international waters of the Arctic Ocean. From a pure security standpoint, a container ship is far safer transiting the Arctic than navigating the congested, sometimes dangerous waters of Southeast Asia or the Middle East. Second, there's the issue of capacity and congestion. The Suez Canal can handle about 50 to 60 ships per day when operating smoothly, but delays are common, and the queue of waiting vessels can stretch for days. The Strait of Malacca, while technically wider, experiences heavy traffic that can slow transit times. The Arctic route, being essentially open ocean for most of its length, has virtually unlimited capacity. There's no queue, no traffic jams, no waiting for your turn through a narrow canal. Third, and perhaps most importantly from a geopolitical perspective, the Arctic route reduces strategic vulnerability. For China, developing this alternative means that in any future crisis scenario, the nation would not be entirely dependent on waterways that pass near U.S. military bases or through waters controlled by American allies. It's really the maritime equivalent of having a backup generator. You hope you never need it, but its existence fundamentally changes your risk calculus. Russia's motivations are equally strategic, but come from a different direction. The sanctions imposed after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and dramatically expanded following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine have severely constrained Russia's ability to trade with the West. Major international shipping companies pulled out of Russian ports. Financial restrictions made transactions difficult. Russia found itself increasingly isolated from the Western-dominated global trading system. The Arctic route represents a way to circumvent this isolation. By developing a direct maritime corridor to China and other Asian nations, Russia can maintain crucial trade relationships without relying on Western logistics infrastructure or financial systems. It's not just about transportation, it's about economic survival and maintaining relevance in the global economy despite Western sanctions. Making this vision a reality requires overcoming extraordinary technical challenges. The Arctic is, honestly, not a friendly environment for human activity. Temperatures can plunge to -40 degrees Celsius. Ice flows can crush steel hulls like tin cans. Storms can appear with little warning, bringing waves that dwarf even the largest vessels. Darkness covers the region for months during the polar winter, and during the brief summer, 24-hour daylight can disorient crews and disrupt normal work cycles. At the heart of making Arctic navigation possible is icebreaker technology. These specialized vessels use reinforced hulls and powerful engines to break through ice that would stop conventional ships dead in their tracks. Without icebreakers clearing the path, Arctic shipping simply doesn't happen. Russia has long been the world leader in icebreaker technology, particularly nuclear-powered icebreakers that can operate continuously without refueling. The country currently operates the world's only fleet of nuclear icebreakers, with vessels like the 50-let Pobedy, 50 Years of Victory, capable of breaking through ice up to 2.8 meters thick. But Russia's icebreaker fleet is aging, and building new ones requires enormous investment. This is where Chinese involvement becomes crucial. China has been developing its own polar capabilities, including the Zhulong 2, or Snow Dragon 2, launched in 2019. This vessel represents a significant technological achievement. It's the first icebreaker designed and built entirely in China, and the first anywhere to feature dual-direction ice-breaking capability, meaning it can break ice, moving both forward and backward. The Zhulong 2 stretches 122.5 meters in length with a beam of 22.3 meters and displaces nearly 14,000 tons. Its ice-breaking capability is rated at PC3 level, meaning it can continuously break through ice up to 1.5 meters thick while maintaining a speed of 2 to 3 knots. The vessel incorporates intelligent ship technology with advanced sensors and automation systems that help it navigate safely through ice fields. But individual ships, no matter how capable, aren't enough. What's needed is a comprehensive infrastructure system. In June 2024, at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, a major milestone was reached. China's Jinxin Shipping Company signed a cooperation agreement with Russia's state-owned Rosatom Nuclear Corporation. The deal calls for building a fleet of 5 ARC-7 class polar container ships, among the most ice-capable commercial vessels ever designed. These ships will be purpose-built for year-round Arctic operations, able to navigate independently through ice up to 1.5 meters thick without icebreaker escort. The first of these vessels is scheduled for delivery in 2027, with the full fleet operational by the end of the decade. This represents a fundamental shift in Arctic shipping capability, moving from summer-only seasonal transit to year-round commercial operations. Beyond ships, the infrastructure requirements include upgraded port facilities capable of handling increased traffic volumes in extreme cold, navigation and communication systems that function reliably in the Arctic's unique environment, search and rescue capabilities for vessels in distress, weather forecasting and ice monitoring systems, and fuel depots and repair facilities along the route. Russia has been upgrading facilities at key Arctic ports, including Murmansk, Zabeta, and Pevek. New deep-water berths, container handling equipment, and cold storage facilities are being constructed. Chinese companies are participating in some of these projects, providing both funding and technical expertise. The numbers tell the story, a route coming to life. Perhaps the most compelling evidence that the Arctic route is transitioning from concept to reality comes from the cargo statistics. According to Russian government data, freight volume along the Northern Sea route has grown dramatically in recent years. In 2014, approximately 4 million tons of cargo transited the route, a respectable figure, but still tiny compared to the hundreds of millions of tons moving through the Suez Canal annually. By 2023, that figure had reached 36 million tons, a ninefold increase in less than a decade. This isn't speculative future growth. This is actual cargo moving through Arctic waters right now. The trajectory is equally impressive. Russian projections suggest that with continued investment and infrastructure development, cargo volumes could reach 80 million tons by 2025 and potentially 270 million tons by 2030. That final figure would represent roughly 10% of current Suez Canal traffic, a substantial share of global trade redirected through the Arctic. So, what's being shipped? Currently, the majority of cargo is Russian exports, liquefied natural gas from Siberian fields, oil and petroleum products, minerals, timber, and fish. But the growing volume increasingly includes container traffic, finished goods and manufactured products moving between Asian and European markets. This is the commercial cargo that represents the route's true potential. Transit times are meeting or even exceeding projections. Vessels that once required 35 to 40 days to reach European ports from East Asia can now make the journey in 22 to 25 days via the Arctic route, a savings of nearly 2 weeks. For time-sensitive cargo like electronics or fresh food products, this reduction is honestly transformative. In August 2024, the cooperation gets official. The summer of 2024 marked a turning point in Arctic route development. In August, China and Russia formally established the Arctic Waterway Cooperation Subcommittee, essentially a joint governmental body specifically dedicated to advancing this project. Now, this might sound like bureaucratic housekeeping, but it represents something more significant. The creation of a dedicated subcommittee means that Arctic route development has moved from being one priority among many to a top-tier strategic project receiving direct attention from both governments. It means that decisions can be made quickly, resources allocated efficiently, and obstacles addressed at the highest levels. The subcommittee's mandate includes coordinating infrastructure investments, harmonizing shipping regulations between the two countries, developing joint ice monitoring and navigation systems, planning search and rescue cooperation, and promoting the route to international shipping companies. This institutional framework provides stability and predictability for companies considering whether to invest in Arctic-capable vessels or commit cargo to the route. When two major governments create permanent cooperative structures, it signals long-term commitment that goes beyond any single administration or political cycle. The American perspective, a strategic shift they didn't see coming. From Washington's viewpoint, the rise of the Arctic Express route represents a significant strategic challenge, not necessarily a crisis, but a development that undermines long-standing American advantages. For decades, U.S. military and economic strategy in the Asia-Pacific has rested partially on the geographic reality of chokepoints. The ability to potentially interdict or monitor traffic through the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, or other narrow passages provided leverage that went far beyond actual military action. The mere possibility that these routes could be disrupted gave the United States significant influence in regional affairs. The Arctic route fundamentally alters this calculus. If a substantial portion of Sino-European trade can flow through waters that never come near U.S. military installations, if Chinese oil imports can arrive via routes that bypass American naval presence, then a key element of U.S. strategic advantage diminishes. American investment in military facilities throughout Southeast Asia, the bases in Singapore, partnerships with Malaysia and Indonesia, the strategic locations being discussed in Australia and elsewhere. All of this infrastructure becomes less effective if the primary target has an alternative route. This doesn't mean the traditional routes will empty overnight. The majority of global shipping will likely continue through established channels for years to come, simply due to inertia, existing infrastructure, and the familiarity of these routes. But the balance is shifting, and with each passing year, the Arctic becomes more viable. The United States has been slow to develop its own Arctic capabilities. The U.S. Coast Guard operates just 2 functional icebreakers, both aging vessels requiring frequent repairs. By comparison, Russia operates more than 40 icebreakers, including nuclear-powered vessels that dwarf American capabilities. China, despite not being an Arctic nation, is building its 3rd icebreaker and has designated itself as a near-Arctic state with legitimate interests in the region. There's growing recognition in Washington that the United States is falling behind in the Arctic, but catching up will require massive investment and take years. Meanwhile, China and Russia are moving forward with their plans right now. The environmental elephant in the ice. No discussion of Arctic route development would be complete without addressing the environmental implications, and honestly, they are profound.